All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Les Smith. I'm with the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this next conversation. Topic is back on and at the table, a discussion of climate and equity. Before we get to our panel of presenters this afternoon, I have a couple of housekeeping slides for everyone. I just want to remind everyone that your microphones are muted. I'm going to show you, there's a couple of ways to where you can send questions to our panel this afternoon. Just also want to remind you that the webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording link with you by earliest by tomorrow morning. For writing questions to this afternoon's panel, you may type a question in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your Zoom control panel located at the bottom of the screen. And if you're using the Hula app, you can type a question in the question and answer box. And with that, Regina, if you are ready, the microphone and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Les. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our session on climate and equity. We could have called it energy and equity. We could have called it a lot of things, because really what we're going to talk about today has a lot to do with how we ensure, as we move to address climate change, to do some of the things we know have to happen to transition how we generate our energy. We have to always keep equity in mind, and how will we do that? So today I'm joined by Dr. Tony Reams, and Tony is the assistant professor and a member of the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. He's at the University of Michigan, which I will not hold against him as a Spartan. For those of you who aren't from Michigan, there's this whole rivalry thing, mostly generated by Spartans, for folks from U of M. And we've got a lot of great people from U of M who are working on environmental justice issues. So I've gained a strong respect for the team there, as well as Amy Bandick from the Citizens Utility Board, and Dr. Brandy Brown, who is our climate and energy advisor. So I'm going to get right to it and have Tony kind of help frame our conversation. He does work on energy justice issues. He's also part of the Climate Justice Brain Trust that was created in conjunction with our work of the Climate Solutions Council to really work on input to develop Michigan's Healthy Climate Plan. So I'm going to turn things over to you, Dr. Reams, and let you start our conversation telling us about your work and why this issue is so important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Regina. It's really exciting to join you and Amy and Brandy on this panel to really talk about an important issue that is core to my research agenda at the University of Michigan. In 2015, I launched the Urban Energy Justice Lab in the School for Environment and Sustainability. And the whole idea was to have a home for research that is really at the intersection of a host of energy topics and equity. And so someone may say, what is energy justice? The whole goal of energy justice is that we create an energy system that fairly disseminates both the benefits and the cost of energy services. And I think what's going to be key to our conversation today is that this is an energy system that is representative and impartial in energy decision making. And so how do we get people engaged, talking about back at the table, how do we get people engaged in something that's highly technical, has a lot of lawyerese that, the average person and, sometimes many of us, can't even begin to understand. And when we talk about those costs, we're talking about the hazards and the externalities that are part of the energy system that we know are imposed disproportionately on communities of color and low-income communities. And how do communities participate in the benefits? We've seen maps that show the distribution of our energy generating systems being hosted by poor communities and communities of color, while the highest energy consumers who receive most of the benefit are located in wealthier, wider suburbs. And so how do we flip that so that all communities receive those benefits? And then there's this procedural justice component. And this is where we talk about who's engaged, who's at the table when decisions are made on energy prices or new energy infrastructure, or where our energy is coming from, whether it's coming from wind or the sun. Who's at the table to make those decisions? And that's why I'm excited about the MAC-EJ, the Climate Brain Trust, and the Climate Council, because we're starting to bring people, at least here in Michigan, to the table to say, this is what we want our energy future to look like. And so I'm excited for this conversation today.
Thank you so much for that. And for those who don't know, the MAC-EJ is the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. So I participated in the plain language session yesterday, and we were talking all about how to make sure people understand what we're talking about. So thank you for that, Dr. Reams. Amy, can you tell me more about CUB and what it does? So the Citizens Utility Board, right?
Sure, yeah, thank you. I'd like to also say I'm happy to have Dr. Reams here doing this important work that's nationally recognized. And as a fellow Spartan, Regina, I also don't hold that affiliation against him. I'm Amy Bandick. I'm the executive director of the Citizens Utility Board of Michigan. So we're a nonprofit group that was established pretty recently in 2018 to be a voice for our residential utility customers here in Michigan. Since then, we've intervened in a number of utility cases at the Michigan Public Service Commission. So we've helped win lower rates and fair treatment of residential customers in that space. We've also launched campaigns to educate customers about utility issues through, articles in the media, blog posts, social media, and through policy papers and comments on cases at the Public Service Commission. We like to put forth ideas for regulatory changes to fix some of the problems that we see with Michigan's utility sector. And through this work, we've seen how electric utility service presents some of the most important but least talked about barriers to equity and justice in energy. In particular, like poor electric reliability, which is essentially how often and for how long does the power go out. Poor electric reliability has impacts that fall hardest on low-income communities and communities of color, which have disproportionately worse electric service and spend a significantly higher chunk of their income on utility bills. So, for example, take having to throw out a fridge full of food because it went bad after your power went out. That might be like an annoying inconvenience for many, but for others, it could be, the difference between eating and starving. So at a really high level, Michigan has some of the worst reliability in the country in terms of how long and how frequently the power goes out. But the problem is particularly bad in communities that have been the most marginalized. So most power outages are rooted in problems with the distribution grid. And so trees knock down wires or circuits short out, equipment's old. The communities that have been traditionally underinvested in generally also tend to have less investment in a strong distribution grid. So the older areas in Michigan that have the above ground distribution, the poles and wires that you can see are the ones that have like the biggest reliability problems. And the fact that utility investment tends to go into capacity expansion, so new places, that means the newer suburban white neighborhoods have newer stuff. And so it becomes inequitable, and the utilities need to find a way to pay attention to and also prioritize the places where reliability problems are just the most consequential. And on top of that, Michigan has some of the highest electricity rates in the country, and certainly the highest rates in the Midwest. So, starting around 2009, electricity rates by residential households in Michigan began increasing at a significantly faster rate than for commercial industrial customers who you saw just kind of stay flat at the same rate. And this was not only compared to previous years, but also compared to the rest of the country. So, one of the things we talk about often is on average, we're paying higher rates for worse service than most of the country, and that's not a good place to be. So this kind of all relates to the concept of energy burden. How much of a burden does paying for not just energy, but quality utility service, delivering energy, take up of your income and your time and your attention? And there's evidence that in Michigan, lower income customers have bigger energy burdens than on the national average. So in general, CUB, we're advocating for several changes that we think we can, begin addressing these problems. And I'm sure we'll get into more detail as time allows, but that's a brief introduction to our work. And I appreciate you having me here. And I've learned a lot lot from the other conference sessions yesterday and today, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Amy. So now I want to hear from Dr. Brandy Brown, my colleague, and she is our climate and energy advisor, but she also has a wealth of experience in this arena. And so, Brandy, can you talk a little bit about both the Michigan Healthy Climate Plan and how we've worked to infuse equity there?
I am so happy to be here with you guys discussing these important issues. To start with the My Healthy Climate Plan, I'm going to show a slide really quickly, just because I find that it is much more accessible if I put it up on the screen so you guys can see some of these pieces that are moving. So essentially, there are two executive actions that underpin a lot of the climate work. The first created the Council on Climate Solutions. And the Council on Climate Solutions is a wide body of folks who are advising EGLE on the creation of the My Healthy Climate Plan. We want them to identify opportunities for the effective implementation of emissions reduction solutions, identify solutions that address the disparities that Dr. Rains and Amy have elevated here, and recommend how we achieve our goals through equitable pathways. So to zero in on the My Healthy Climate Plan, that is still coming to fruition. And a lot of the pieces, including the Climate Justice Brain Trust, the MACI-J, the council, everyone is giving us input on their perspectives, what solutions have drawbacks and benefits, and how we could potentially put them together for our future. Now, just to give you a little insight into how globally folks think about this. Now, when we're looking at our 2050 goal to all the way to the right side of the slide, we're looking towards carbon neutrality. But before we get to carbon neutrality, we first have to figure out how we're getting to 2040. And before that, 2030. Right now, we are on the path to knocking down the first block for reduction of 28% emissions. And we need all of those dominoes to fall. We need them to fall in a way that benefits everyone. Now, if we think about what those opportunities for those pathways to make that happen, we can think about it as a business case, right? If decarbonization were my business and I needed to expand it, I'm going to look for first people who have not tried my business. All right. We're going to look at the people who have not been served yet by my business. That's folks who have not had the opportunity to take part in weatherization programs, or maybe they have and it hasn't gone far enough. We're going to think about people who would be best served by whatever I'm bringing. Those are the folks who have a higher energy burden, where there's an opportunity to match lower cost energy resources to folks who have higher bills. Older infrastructure, Amy brought that up. We have tons of older infrastructure across the state that we can upgrade to reduce our overall energy consumption. That's an opportunity there. And then finally, we have an opportunity to reduce health impacts across Michigan from the things that have been putting out emissions that are causing this decarbonization problem. So if I'm just looking at it from a business case scenario, and those are the four things that I know I can move towards to achieve my goal, I would also then notice that those are all things that align with equity. So as we were putting together our plan, we're recognizing that the opportunity for decarbonization really lies in the same places where we've had inequities in our state. And if we are going to hit our goals, these are the pathways we need to move down. Now, the inverse of that is we are not going to achieve our decarbonization goals without moving down these pathways. If we go into this energy transition and build an energy future without addressing these problems, we are going to have wide swaths of our friends and neighbors, wide swaths of our communities who are not served. And that is emissions on the table, if you will. And we cannot move forward without it. So I will stop there, and I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you so much for that, Brandy, or Dr. Brown. So I will, just for the introductions, I did Dr. Reams and Dr. Brown. I know I will slip into Tony and Brandy, so just be prepared. Thank you all for giving that overview of kind of how you come at thinking about climate and equity. So Tony, this question is for you. In your work around energy justice, what do you think are the primary things that as we plan forward to address climate, meaning we reduce or change our energy mix, that we need to think about to make sure we lift up communities who have borne most of the impact of our fossil fuel economy as we move toward a renewable economy?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So a lot of my work has focused on energy efficiency. I view that as one of the, kind of gateways into renewable energy and increasing energy access to, new technology. I'm a former civil engineer, and so I was an infrastructure engineer, and I did a lot of capital improvement planning in local government. So you have a 5-year plan where you know where your old roads are, you know where your old pipes are, and you create a plan to strategically replace those. I'm excited that the Biden administration has included housing as part of its infrastructure proposal, because we have to treat our buildings as infrastructure. They are integral to how we deliver energy, to where we need to improve our infrastructure, as Amy and both Brandy brought up. And so if we make buildings, make homes more efficient, particularly for households who are already struggling to afford the energy that they consume. We know with climate change, there's going to be colder winters, hotter summers. We're going to see increase in air conditioning here in Michigan, which, a lot of homes are not even built with AC. And so how do we make homes more resilient to impending climate change? And then think about what that transition looks like to newer, smarter technology, cleaner energy. And so we can also reduce how much of that we build, right? So we don't make the same mistake of overbuilding infrastructure that is used, is not used. We spend a ton of money that ratepayers have to foot the bill for, but really do it strategically. And the only way we can do that is think about it from an equity perspective at the beginning, and from a systems perspective.
So how do we do that? How do, when we think about encouraging that, what can be done to actually make it happen? Like go from talking about it to making it real. How do we do that?
Yeah, so I'll take, a simple study that we did. So we call it our light bulb study. So, and I had this idea because I heard an NPR story saying that prescriptions or a prescription drug was more expensive in CVS in a poor neighborhood than it was in a CVS in a suburb. So the same medication, same store, but the prices were different just because of where it was located. And so one of the things people say, well, why don't, low-income people just buy more efficient technology, right? And so we wanted to take something as simple as a light bulb. So you have your really inefficient LED incandescent bulbs, and you have your really efficient LED bulbs. So we wanted to see if we took the Detroit Metro, we divided it into income groups. And so areas that had less than 10% of the population in poverty, and areas that had more than 40% of the population in poverty. And what we found was that the price to transition from an incandescent bulb to an LED bulb was twice in poorer neighborhoods than it was in more wealthy neighborhoods. And LED bulbs were less than half available in poor neighborhoods. And so you could potentially walk in a store in a lower income neighborhood and not see any LED bulbs. And so that's a very simple problem, right? If we want people to make this transition, it has to be available and has to be affordable. And one of the issues was that utility companies often partner with larger stores, big box stores like Home Depot and Lowe's, which don't locate in lower income neighborhoods. And so that's a whole nother economic development issue that we have to solve. But making it available and making it affordable is one simple step that we can make.
Yeah,
I was just going to ask you about cars. Go ahead, Amy.
No, I'd also add, just to add on to that, is the way our energy efficiency programs are currently set up is it's often rebate based, right? So if I go out and I buy a new, washing machine or refrigerator at Home Depot or somewhere, then I can, get a rebate for my utility. But, low income families can't necessarily just go out and make that big purchase, certainly not without financing help. And so we need to also be thinking about ways that we can improve the energy efficiency program. So it's, so we're not putting these barriers in place, even if someone wants to get a more efficient appliance or upgrade their home.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So in planning, Brandy, I'm going to take the planning question to you. I know as the My Healthy Climate Plan is being developed, and in your experience, how do you avoid some of the things that impact communities adversely, and, in that planning process? So it sounds like you have to build it in as you plan, right? Which I know we've had conversations about, that it can't be an afterthought, because then you end up with the results of, economies of scale and other things driving choices that then have adverse impact on low-income communities. So do you have a thought about how you build that in up front?
Oh yeah, I have many thoughts. So planning is key. My mind goes to the topic of this panel, which is alluding to that table. And so you do want to make sure that you're thinking about those things in planning, but all along the way of those opportunities to buy a light bulb or buy more efficient appliances, and where they're offered and why they're offered, how long and how much, someone is making a decision all the way. And we have to, I want to take it back to something that Governor Whitmer said earlier. All of us need to think about our biases and why we're making different decisions. And sometimes we are familiar with certain big box stores, so they come top of mind to us because they're in our communities, right? But they may not be they may not be serving all communities, as Tony said. So we need to widen out our perspective and consider that our pathway to developing a solution may not be inclusive. I was reminded of that when I worked in energy efficiency for a while. And I would be talking to my friends and family about, yeah, you got to get these different appliances. There are programs offered by our utility, and my family does not hear about it. And I had to reflect that even though I worked in that space, no, not even though, that the only reason I knew about energy efficiency and solar potential and all of these things was because I worked in this area. But none of my friends and family are aware of the opportunities, and we must ask ourselves why. So not only should we plan to expand our outreach, our communication, our education, but every step of the way, if we're seeing uptake only amongst, upper income, retired, married, college educated people, which is where most of our energy efficiency program dollars go, then we need to think about what about everyone else? Why aren't we getting them? And as climate and energy advisor, I'm keen on figuring out how we bring everyone into that puzzle so that we can hit our goals in the long term.
So how can we hear community voices in the process? Tony, your light bulb study was probably not news to the experts with the lived experience of going to the store. And, maybe Brandy, when you told your relatives about energy efficiency and changing bulbs, they may have gone to look for the bulbs and said, that's 3 times the price. I'm not buying that. So how do you hear lived experiences that help you not only plan better, but almost become advocates? Like, I think that the key, my background is in advocacy, and I think about, if nobody knows about a problem, how do they start to fix it, right? So the people who live it have their individual experiences. They may talk to each other, but how do you bring that to light so that, to me, the fact that in different neighborhoods, the same thing can be different prices. They'll say it's on demand and there are other market-driven decisions, but how do we switch that mindset? And I throw that open for the panel.
I'll just give, one example. So we, a few faculty members and a few communities in Detroit, the Jefferson East community, Southwest Detroit, and Parkside Village, we formed a partnership to really get at this, right? Trying to understand how can we break down barriers to accessing the programs that both Amy and Brandy talked about, as far as energy efficiency, home repair, because we know that these programs require different applications and different offices. And so people are bouncing around to different agencies, trying to, cobble these different programs together to improve their homes, improve their affordability. And so we created kind of a community-based approach where we hired a case manager, community-based case manager, who has created like a team of individuals in the community that begin to share experiences, begin to talk about the challenges of applying for programs or not even knowing about programs. And so with that collective information, how can we be strategic in, saying, okay, well, what are the same things you need for all 5 applications for these programs? And can we help households get through that? If somebody has to go to work during the day, can the case manager begin to pull information together? And so it's really going to communities, listening to representatives from the community, like our community action agencies, our community development corporations, our neighborhood associations, because sometimes there are groups that represent community that may not actually be from communities. And so actually, going to the places where we need to hear information from to actually improve processes.
Yeah, thanks for that. Anybody else have a perspective?
Yeah, I'm so excited to see how that turns out. And I think, one other thing to add, the Michigan Public Service Commission, they just recently formed the Energy Affordability and Accessibility Collaborative, EAC, always an acronym, right? So that allows stakeholders to work with the commission to kind of develop ideas to improve, like Tony was saying, energy assistance programs. One issue the commission staff has said they want to tackle is making the questions of like, which assistance do I qualify for less confusing? You have different programs with different eligibility standards. And I think we just need to make it easier for people if they need assistance, to understand how they qualify and apply for it. But also we need to make bills more affordable in general, so that we're not, relying so much on assistance, but that, that people who want to be able to pay their bills can at an affordable rate.
Yeah, thank you for that. Brandy, do you have anything you want to add? Or
I do. I'll just tag on that. In the climate planning that we've been doing, Regina and I have talked many times about how we bridge that gap. And what we've discussed is kind of the hierarchy of state government and all the different boxes that we have. And we want people to come fit in our boxes to engage. And that is not the way that many of communities of color engage in things. And so we have really questioned how we operate, and had some really good conversations about what the differences are when we show up professionally versus when we're showing up in our community, and then trying to build those bridges. We are hopeful that the Climate Justice Brain Trust is one of those solid bridges, and we're working hard to make sure that it is effective and supported. But as we work through, that process, we've had a lot of lessons learned about translating different needs and translating the value, the perceived value from either our professional work or community work.
yeah, I think that's a really good point. We often talk about going to, meeting communities where they are. We also have to meet the folks who can facilitate these changes where they are, right? They're not coming from the same base of knowledge, lived experience that many of the people who are impacted by the decisions that are made are coming from. And so one of the valuable things we've talked about in terms of the Climate Brain Trust process is, how do we make sure early on in the planning process that folks have the opportunity to hear from the experts on the Brain Trust? There are 5 folks. Tony is one of them. They're all part of the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. And so within the planning process, like the Climate Solutions Council, there are different work groups. And so just ensuring that there is there's both written and opportunities to engage. So written information and opportunities to engage, because one of the things I see this as kind of a continuum, right? We have to be able to connect dots. And so I'm going to throw this out there in terms of strategies to connect dots. That's one thing. I mean, that's on the planning end, but on the real lived experience end, how do we translate that? How do we, one, help the companies, the industries, the people who are going to make decisions that impact folks get it? And how do we help people who are trying to be heard, be heard? What role can we play in that from all our different vantage points? So I'll see who wants to jump on that first.
Okay, I'll give one example. So I got into this work, the energy justice, environmental justice work as a researcher during the last recession, and so 2008, 2009. And we all remember the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, known as the stimulus, ton of money for energy, right? Ton of money for a lot of environmental things. And so I was in Kansas City, Missouri at the time, and there was a project there called the Green Impact Zone. And a part of that was really trying to concentrate these dollars that were coming from the federal government to the local community in one area, particularly in a disinvested, majority African-American urban community in Kansas City. And so part of that was weatherization dollars. So, several $1 million for weatherization. The congressman at the time said we were going to weatherize every home, 8,000 houses. But they didn't get enough money to do that. They got enough to do about 600 homes. But in the end, they only weatherized 300 homes. And so through that process, there was a lot of kind of after action discussions about what worked and what didn't work. And a part of that was, how do you communicate this framing of sustainability in communities who have a lack of trust for any type of government funding? And so it's like, oh, we're doing free weatherization. Why don't people sign up for it? And so the example I want to use is, when they first tried to inform the community about this opportunity to weatherize their homes, they employed local college students during the summer from University of Missouri, Kansas City, which was adjacent to the neighborhood. As you can imagine, I just said this was a majority African-American, a lot of older homeowners. And you can imagine who signed up to volunteer to pass out information during the summer from the university. And so I remember sitting in one meeting, and one of the student reps came in and said, nobody would open the door for us. And I think that was a light bulb moment for the planners of the process, because you had a lot of eager young kids that are not from the neighborhood coming into the neighborhood trying to give out information. And so they created a block captain system using trusted members of the community to actually give out the information. And there was a whole different result. And so really this idea of trusted messengers, figuring out who that is and how you translate information from quote experts to those trusted messengers who can then take that message home to their community. So churches, barbershops, beauty salons, the person that runs the corner market, trying to figure out how you actually infuse information into the places where people actually go for information, because it might not be me and it might not be any of us on this panel, but those people are eager, and so you make those connections.
And that's a good point, Tony. I'd just like to jump in, and where my thoughts went on your point about having the trusted messengers and understanding what messages work. There's a lot of layers there, right? There's a lot of background knowledge that you have to have about communities and the history there, and what system we've built over generations that has led to a lack of trust and a lack of engagement. And if we broaden out and we look at climate work across the country, there is a lack of representation from many communities. And so we see organizations now reaching out and trying to fill that gap. But what we also see happening is internally, folks are having that same kind of push and pull, because we're working with different historical understandings and different historical experiences. And without peeling back all of those layers, and acknowledging what truths we don't know, whatever plan that we build, we're just going to keep running into those instances where there's a disconnect, where communities don't trust. And until we start the planning process to know where those barriers are, where the pitfalls are, what people have experienced, we're not going to be able to build the system, the climate future that we need.
Yeah, I mean, the points that you both brought up are so important. And you know, us as an organization, we're constantly struggling, you know, with the right way to engage community. Some of the things that we're trying to work on CUB is, you know, policies that impact you know, residential customers where they don't really have to do much work. So like, for an example, there's an issue where it comes to bill credits. Right now, if your power's been out for a certain amount of time or a certain number of times a year, you're eligible for like a $25 flat credit, but it's on you to contact your utility, track how long your power has been out, see if you meet that threshold, apply for the credit, and then you may or may not get the $25 credit if you qualify. Now, who has time to do that, right? So we found is when we actually saw some publicly available data from Consumers Energy, for example, they owed over $1 million in these bill credits to over 48,000 customers. And that year, which was 2017, they only paid out about $4,000 to about 200 customers. So that's like a huge difference in the people that actually experienced those outages and who got compensated for it. So one thing CUB has been advocating for is automatic bill credits, right? We have smart meters. You know how long my power has been out and how many times it's been out. You know, it will take a little work, but you can update the system so that I automatically get that credit. And on top of that, we'd like to see those bill credits actually reflect the cost of losing power. So, reflect the duration of the outage. And we've been working on, through the My Power Grid process, advocating for these automatic bill credits. And I think we've gotten to the point where the utilities agree that's possible. So let's just do it. Let's take action. Let's make that happen. And that's something that you're going to see actually, you know, affects people's pocketbooks, but they didn't have to like show up at a Public Service Commission, you know, meeting to ask for it. So let's not make it so hard for some of these issues. Let's be intentional about it and make it better.
That's a really good point. I mean, so many of the things, access is an issue, right? How do folks even know that information is available? You know, the theme of this conference is, ends with removing barriers. And oftentimes lack of information is a huge barrier. So a program can be created that's at the government level, the corporate level, industry level, but if you don't know about it or you can't access it, how do you benefit from that? And I think that lends itself to both transparency and opportunity and communication, right? So how do we communicate it? I know from the EGLE perspective, there are many regulations that our regulators follow, that the regulations were written so long ago, they say things like put a notice in the newspaper, right? So who reads a newspaper now? And then even if you're gonna click to pay to read an article, I doubt if it would be about what hearings are coming up related to a Public Service Commission or a regulatory action. So what role, we've got a few questions that I'm going to get to. I know we're getting close to time, but there's a theme in some of the questions around what can people do, to really look at building equity into processes that they don't control, right? That they don't control. How do they, everything is built on an economic model. How do we look at outcome versus process? And so any thoughts on that? We can't hear you, Tony.
All right, I was trying to punt it over to Brandy.
This is why your mic wasn't on, because Brandy was like, no, Tony, you go first.
I've been thinking about, this whole idea of the clean energy transition, right? And, there's a lot of scholars that are writing about the just transition, and a lot of, activists are pushing for the just transition. And I think, if we listen to the language that is coming out of our federal government and at some state governments, and really what's happening at a lot of the local levels, I think that whole think globally, act locally is still key here in this transition period, because the local governments are hearing from their citizens, hopefully, right? And they know that they're getting warmer or that they're having these major, cold weather events. I mean, if we look at Texas, I mean, how can the largest energy producing state, just kind of lose its stuff when it comes to, a major event? And so do we want to see those type of events happening across the country? And so when is the wake up call to say everything cannot just be about cost effectiveness? We have to invest in our energy infrastructure, in our building stock, and in our people. And so again, this is a whole system. I mean, there's a whole idea of systems thinking where all these things are interdependent. And if we don't think that way, then we're going to have these catastrophes, and it could be deadly. And so let's talk about it. Let's talk about this. This is a crisis, right? We are at a moment where we have to do something different. And the old way just won't work anymore. And so that's no answer, but I know we definitely just need.
It's a prompt, right? It's a challenge for us to think about it differently. We are in our last couple minutes, so I didn't know if Brandy and then Amy wanted to have an opportunity to address. There are more questions in the chat, in the question box that we can get to. So we'll try to answer those, and panelists, please, if you have an opportunity to go in and if you want to directly answer those. But Brandy, if you have closing thoughts in terms of our last couple minutes of where we need to go with climate inequity.
Yeah, certainly. So my closing thoughts are, it's a simple statement, but it is complex at its core, is that we need to essentially reframe everything. We need to conduct a meta evaluation, essentially evaluate our thinking on why our energy system exists in the first place. And it existed, we created this to have reliable, safe energy, reliable, cost-effective, safe energy. And there is truth in that just being cost-effective or just being reliable for some is not sufficient for the future that we need to build. So we need to rethink, why do we have this energy system? What is its purpose? And then build up around that purpose. And in doing that, we have to include values from different communities and different folks, and we need to value different communities and different folks. So I don't have an answer on how you translate that. I just know that there is a lot of opportunity for us to do a much better job. And first, listening to what folks are telling us if they have health concerns of how we're producing energy right now, if they are not benefiting, if we see that when we go through this energy transition that only some will benefit from it, then we need to back up and look at, again, what are we building? What carbon neutral future are we building? And is it serving everyone?
Thank you for that. And Amy.
Well, I'm glad you saved me for last because I have all the answers. Totally kidding. No, I think Tony and Brandy brought up just excellent points. And I think for CUB in particular, like the consumer advocate role has traditionally been like, what's the cheapest, most cost-effective option for residential customers? And we understand, CUB, that, that's not the way we can look at it anymore. We need to also be investing in communities that have been traditionally underinvested in. And we also need to be making strides towards, addressing the crisis that is climate change. So we will be there, checking the math in the cases, always making sure that residential customers aren't disproportionately being, piled onto. But we understand that there's definitely some, investments that need to be made to make things right. So I appreciate what the other panelists said, and this has been really a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you all for participating in this conversation. The time goes by so quickly, particularly when there's so much to talk about. And I think for all of us, the work that we're doing in our varying lanes that overlap is all focused on coming up with opportunities to really enhance the opportunity of communities who are suffering right now in a lot of different ways, whether it's from high bills, lack of access. And we have to make sure that when we move to our renewable, our new economy, that the folks who have been at a deficit also benefit economically. So I just want to throw that out there and end that on, end our session. Thank you all for participating. And thank you everyone for joining us. Our next session begins at 2:45. So you have about a half an hour before that one. And that one is focused on, for the next 7 generations, tribal perspectives on environmental justice. So I'm looking forward to that. Thank you, everybody, and have a great afternoon.